What's up, everybody? Uh, Thank you guys for joining us once more for our third tournament podcast episode. We've got the third episode, that means we've got the third guest, and that completes our little rundown of getting a guest from every team. So with this one, I've grabbed Rever from Team Halu, and Team Halu is, of course, the spiciest team in the tournament so far, I would say. So I'm definitely excited for this episode. We've got some interesting topics to hit on, and as I said here, maybe I want to start with this. I think Team Halu is definitely the most interesting team because you guys have just been so different than everybody else in the tournament. So before we get into uh, our points of discussion here or anything. Do you think there's any reason why your team is doing stuff so differently than everybody else? I mean, in terms of priority or anything, is there anything? Do you think you guys are just ahead of the curve, or how? What's your opinion on this whole thing?
Yeah, I guess firstly, thanks for having me on. It's good to have a bit of a chat. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, of course, as well with the tournament ongoing, I'll do my best not to give too much away and keep it pretty general. Um, but I think, yeah, from what we've seen in the first few games, we've definitely had sort of a bit of a different drafting strategy and probably different things that we've focused on. But yeah, as you said, I think it's been pretty good because it's probably added a bit of a different dimension and something a bit different for the viewers to watch when we play the games as well.
Yep, definitely. I mean, it's enjoyable when there's not when everybody isn't doing the same thing. Basically, that goes, yeah, without saying, of course. All right. So let's dive into it, I guess. As I just said, you guys were or have been doing stuff a bit differently, but we're starting today off by talking about something that is not different and that everybody is doing the same, and that's our little, yeah, our staples of the tournament, that being the Zulu and the Celts. Of course, Zulu being banned in every game, yeah, without exception, and the Celts being picked almost every game, but never having gotten a win. That's our two never changing variables here. And basically, we've talked this question into the ground by now. Everybody's given it their thoughts. So I'll keep it short with you. Do you think anything about that it's going to change? Are the Celts going to become more successful in the future? Are the Zulu ever going to be left open? What do you think?
Yeah, so the Zulu haven't been picked yet, right?
No, the Zulu, they couldn't have
Because
been. They've been banned every single
yeah,
game in the first rotation.
yeah. So I think I haven't seen all the games, but yeah, the ones I've played, definitely they've been banned. Yeah, I think it's unlikely we'll see them feature just because they're so OP on these small maps. So you probably saw in the Hunger Games, Zulu was obviously a very favorable pick. And I think when you have the opportunity to ban, getting rid of a Civ that's good in almost any scenario is worth banning straight away. So yeah, I'm not surprised that they've been banned in every game, and I'm not sure if they'll get to feature. Like I can't even think of a situation where there would be a reason to keep them in and potentially let your opponent pick them. Um, the Celts one is interesting as well. So have they not won a game yet?
They are 7 losses in their 7 games. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's probably more surprising. And I don't think there's an obvious answer. I think one thing that's interesting is that in the Hunger Games tourney that I referred to before, the 2v2 one, I think often what you found on those 2v2 maps is that you ended up at the start of a game really having two sets of one versus one. And
Yeah.
so when it's a one versus one, Celts are really strong. But what we've seen in these 20 maps in the three versus three is that usually the orientation is where you've got sort of one Civ on each team sandwiched between two enemy players, or at least the ones that I've played on have been like that. And the problem is that if Celts is that Civ that's crunched between two others, it quickly becomes a poor choice because it's not the sort of Civ that wants to be on the defensive versus two opponents. So I haven't seen all the games that have been played, but it'd be interesting to see if often the games that Celts have been in, whether they've been the Civ that was sandwiched between two opponents.
Yeah, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I think that has happened very often, and even if they weren't sandwiched, even if they weren't directly sandwiched, people definitely made it a point to get on over there and choke them as best as possible. So there's definitely merit to it, and you're absolutely right. Those maps where it's always two enemies close to you, those have been played quite often, and I guess that's more difficult for the Celts to handle than you're probably right about that. I'll talk more about a specific case of this later on when we discuss aggressives as a whole. Um, but yeah, no, that's interesting. So we're not really sure how these things are going to change going forward. Especially the Zulu thing is, of course, very interesting. I guess just my thoughts there is obviously it's always on the second picking team to decide whether or not they want to leave the Zulu open. And I guess the only reason to do that would be if there was any Civ available that you want to trade for Zulu, right? Because if you leave Zulu open, then you pretty much you're assuming the opponent is gonna first pick it guaranteed. So then if there's any Civ that you think you would like to rather have than Zulu, or that you feel you would do well against Zulu with, then I guess you could do that. It's just that nobody feels like there's a Civ like that available right now. So makes sense that we haven't really seen that happen yet. But all right, I guess we revisit that topic once anything changes in those stats. Moving on then, a second topic I want to do today is talking a little bit about drafting strategy, but not like directly, talking about how your team drafts, because that is of course counter to your best interest. However, what I want to talk about is there seems to be clear tendencies between players in this tournament, where some players tend to always play the civs that are picked early. They tend to always use their first pick for themselves, and other players tend to always yeah, just be put onto civs that were picked very late in the draft. Some examples for this is that Halu and Rabdag nearly always get the first pick civ, whereas you, Kismic, and Obi, interestingly, are players that traditionally play civs that are picked towards the end of the draft. And basically, what I was wondering is there a is one of these things better than the other? Do you want to have your best player play a strong pick that's picked early, or is there a actually an upside to having your captain or your best player be the one who takes the later picks in the draft and giving the stronger picks to his teammates? Where do you come down on this? What do you think? Is there a preferable end of that spectrum?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's interesting that you mentioned, Obi, myself. I think there was one other that have often gone last as well.
Kismic, yeah.
Um, Kismet. So I think uh, it's probably more that obviously you've probably got sort of three types of players. You've got players that are really good at building. You've got players that are good at what I call the dagger. So they're good at very nimble, only a few units, but very smart, well thought out attack. And then you've got your players that are really good at sledgehammering. So they just build massive stacks and then they come out turn 40 with a stack of 30 horsemen or something like that. And it's just a numbers game. Um, and then you've got a few players who are really good at all three and are very versatile. And depending on what civ or land they get, they can play any of those three strategies. Um, so I think it's not necessarily, oh, your best player should get the first pick or the best civ. It's more that you've got players with strengths and weaknesses. And every now and then, I'm not surprised to hear that Obi has often gotten the third pick. And I think it's more that Obi can probably play every civ and every strategy. And he might have other people on his team that he's playing with that are much better at one of those three strategies. Um, like I mean, Kiz has been great in this tournament from what I've seen. And he's a really good, in my view, a really good sledge player. He's really good at building big stacks and just rolling out those numbers to take out his opponent. So you might just find that the third pick in that team has often been the sledgehammer player. Maybe a Scandinavia or a Persia or something like that. Um, that's probably what I would reckon is the most likely.
Yeah, honestly, you're pretty accurate with all that you've said right there. It's very interesting, and uh, you're absolutely right. Kismic has been playing Scandinavia last pick, Persia last pick. I've got right here, Egypt last pick. So that's just a few of them to mention. So you're right on the money with that. In general, I think with the Obi thing, it's very interesting. So he's played 5 games. He's gotten first pick and second pick once each, and he's lost both of these games. And in these games, he's played pretty much the same Civ. He played Celts first pick, and he played Iroquois second pick. And those are like builder civs, I would say, right? Agri, strong, unique unit that you want to stack. And that hasn't worked out for his team in those 2 games. But the 3 games where he was last pick, they won 2 of those. And that was actually Japan both times. So
Mm.
that is interesting. That's more of a utility Civ, I would say. Like not definitely not a high tier Civ in many people's opinion. He's like the only one that seems to value them. However, that's what he's been able to make work. And you're absolutely right that there's specialists, I would say, and all rounders. And Obi has Rabdag on his team, who is pretty much the biggest specialist in this tourney. I would say he's like all inning on rushes every time he can get them. Wants to always get those, and that's why he's always gotten first pick pretty much, because they always just first pick the rusher and given it to Rabdag, and that complements Obi well in a sense where he can then take a later pick and still get a lot of value out of it. Whereas if you stick a lower tier player on a late pick, and maybe there's not as many options left anymore to pick with that late pick, then maybe that lower tier player doesn't get a Civ where they can have a big impact. So that's definitely right. There's roles within players in a team even before Civs are picked. So that makes sense. And Kismic as
What's
well. Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, what's interesting is that, I remember, probably a couple of decades ago now, playing in the championship cups that we had, and there were even in all the different clans, you had a player who was a specialist at Aztec, and you had a player that was a specialist at Iroquois. Um, that's how I remember it. And you had different players who played different civs perfectly, and so you always tried to pick civs based on, what different people were specialists at.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and that I think is also very interesting with Kismic because he's pretty much the best performing, or he's the best the player with the best win rate, I would say in this tourney. He's played 5 games and he's won 4 of them. So and I think of course he's been playing well, but it's not like he's head and shoulders above every other player in this tournament. Of course, a 5 game sample size. I also don't want to overblow this topic, but what I think this mainly says is that on Team Anti, they are probably lacking players that can make last pick work. And when he's on the team and he's playing and he's getting last pick, he's making it work. But yeah, that's I guess he's like their guy that's effective on those late picks. Whereas if he's not playing, I'm not even sure they've won a game without him picking last. So oh yeah, they have, but it, they probably only won. So that's what I think, and you've made a good point there. There's roles to this, and I think Kismic is a very important team part of his team in that regard because he's been really getting a lot of those late picks. He's also one of the players with the most kills in the tournament, so definitely paying off if you've got a good drafting strategy that takes into account the different roles as you've also called it on your team. All right, that was an interesting one, definitely, and I'll be looking forward to tracking those stats as we move into the playoffs as well. Okay, so let's move on from the theoretical drafting topic, and I want to discuss something more specific next here, and that is basically just Rome as a civ. They are they are always a controversial, if I would say. Some people rate them really highly in MPT. Others don't think that they're anything special. For this tournament here, they've had a little bit of a cold start, but lately they've been crushing it totally. Just to give the people watching a couple of stats here, they have the best record of any civs. They've got 5 wins and 1 loss, which is crazy to me. They've got four kills in the tournament, so basically they're getting 2/3 of a kill in every game that they're picked. That is tied for most, and yeah, overall they've just been doing great lately. Rever also, you've had a very good Rome game just this last game that was played. So how good is Rome? Are they better than Persia, for example? That is something they're often compared against. And did I get them right on my tier list where I ranked them top 8? I put them above all the random civs, but I put them just below all the agri civs, Aztecs, and Sumeria. So where do you come down on this? How good is Rome, and or is it just that you are so great that they look OP? What's the matter here?
Oh, definitely that I'm just so great. That's the only answer I can think of.
Exactly,
No, of
exactly.
course not. Of course not. No, it's a good question, and it's probably I have to be sort of careful what I say about them and any other specific civ, just because it feeds into the way that we draft. But I think a big advantage of Rome is that it's so versatile, and there's probably a few different things that you can do with it. Um, and being industrious, you're also able to probably deal with some worse starts. So you've got some flexibility with your unit selection as well as the way you play the land that you get. Um, it's interesting that you mentioned Persia at the same time because Persia is similar, being industrious as well, and also with a unique unit that is attack based. There is differences around some of that versatility. But yeah, it's an interesting point that Rome has been that successful. Um, it's funny because, as you said at the very start, Celts have been so unsuccessful, and Rome has done so well. Um, but yeah, there's nothing obvious that points to why I think a team that's picking Rome has won the game. I think maybe it's just been more about other factors in those matches.
I would say that is right because one thing that I've noticed a lot during drafting, people are very people are pretty much in agreement about what the first rotation is supposed to look like. You've got like 4 or 5 civs that are always banned and picked in the first 4. So that makes sense. But after that, and in that second and third picking rotation, that's when a lot of civs start coming into the mix that people just view very differently. And typical picks in that regard, assuming that all the agri civs are off the table at this point, which hasn't always been the case, but typical civs below the agri civs that were picked up next are Rome, but also Egypt, which is one of the civs that's been just picked a ton here, and only recently has also started winning a couple of games. And then there's just a bunch of random one-offs in that spot, but Rome has definitely been doing the best, and especially in a couple of times they've even been allowed to be picked up third, like in your last win, you got them as a last pick, and the same thing for a couple of other guys as well, actually. So that is an interesting one. Definitely, we've got Rome doing very well lately, and I want to add as well that is their distinctive identity to me is that when you're playing the difference to Persia basically is that sure Persia have got that 4 attack unit which is just crazy. They can maybe brute force some kills harder, but that one extra defense point in the legions just makes it so that as soon as Rome gets their iron, they're basically unkillable in my mind. When I see them in this tourney, as soon as they've got that iron, they're basically unkillable. Once you upgrade just a few legions, nobody's able to really hit through that.
which which talks to that versatility. That's what I was, yeah, pointing to
Exactly.
before, is that you've got both that really strong offense and that strong defense as well.
And that is crazy because that's not only that you can't kill Rome, but it's also once Rome starts moving to you and gets onto a single road of yours, you're never getting that back. It's like when you've got a road taken from you with like two legions on it and maybe two archers, you're never taking that back. Unless you've got like 8 catapults standing around, there's no shot. So honestly, I think it's coming through very strong here, and I expect them to rise in priority even harder and become a staple of the in the second round of picks. One last thing, maybe I've seen this especially from Elk in that one game, people just opening maybe one or two warriors, I don't know, then just straight going for barracks and making a couple of veteran archers to send them out onto the map. Uh, is that a thing? Is that a standard play as Rome? Just going for the very early barracks into archers?
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. I don't think I've seen that one. Was that from Elk?
Yeah, I've seen it specifically. I
Yeah,
remember in the Elk game, so in the one just before yours, last time we played. But yeah, is that
yeah.
do you think that is ever a efficient play, or is it just something that to maybe throw a curveball and surprise somebody with?
I think it's, I mean, I haven't seen that play before. I think it's interesting that they're going straight into veteran archers. Is there more value in having just a couple of warriors and regular archers sitting underneath them? Um, so it's interesting that they go barracks into vet archers when I would have thought normally you're barracks and then, you're preparing to stack vet warriors for when you hook the iron. Um, but definitely something I've noticed is that both Elk and SDN, I very much sort of expect the unexpected from those two because they have very unique openings and a different way of doing things. So I'm not surprised it was Elk that was doing that, but I'm sure he had a good reason why.
That's right. I always think that's those are two players that don't seem to make their decisions based on maths, calculating stuff in advance, and being like going into the practice tool, testing out the same opening 10 different times to see which is the most optimized play. They seem to very much go with the flow and do just what seems reasonable to them at the time, and it's very refreshing to have people like that play as well, I think. So I like that strategy. I don't think it's the most efficient, especially as you said. There's not that much difference in having a reg or a veteran archer early on, in my opinion. But yeah, it's not like he's spamming 10 archers or anything, right? He's just making a very few and then sending them out and seeing if they can pressure anybody. But hey, you're right. That's maybe a trademark thing of players like SDN and Elk to just do the unexpected, as you said. All right.
Maybe one other thing I'll add is I managed to dig up that tier list that you did of the civs
Yeah, yeah.
from top to bottom. And I just having a look at it, I definitely think, in my opinion, that the first three rows, so including Rome, I think all of those civs are definitely in the top three rows. But I don't know if necessarily I'd have them all in the same order. There's probably a couple there that I would bump up and a couple there that I would drop down, in my view.
All right, so
So that's probably interesting.
it is definitely interesting because that means to me that as I'm for the viewers, as I'm just putting the tier list up again really quickly, you can see right here. This is the one we're talking about. So the first 3 rows, you're saying that basically is all we need to know for the sake of this topic, right? Because you're saying Rome definitely does belong within the realm of those civs. So I felt
Yeah,
I
yeah.
felt a bit
I
controversial
put
when I
I
ranked
put
them,
Rome above them.
but yeah.
Oh, sorry, you go.
No, no, just I felt a bit controversial when I ranked them that high, but it seems like that maybe is accurate for a tourney.
Yeah, yeah. But I think overall that's the right broader picture. There's probably just a couple that I would personally shuffle different ways. But you've also seen more games than I've seen, so you've seen all of them. So it's probably pretty close to what people on average would view as the top three ranks.
Yeah, makes sense. Interesting one though. So I'm excited for more Rome. Definitely, they are promoting some interesting gameplay, I would say. So I wouldn't mind seeing more of them. All right then. So that's our Rome topic here. Moving on then to another maybe draft related thing, but also we can spin it more in a gameplay direction. That being a short discussion basically of what the agri trade does to your team composition. Because for the viewers at home again, I've got a stat right here that was very confusing and interesting to me. Basically, right, we're playing a 3v3 tourney here, so there's 3 civs on every team for every game. And in games where one team had one more aggressive than their opponents, that team with that one more aggressive has won 3 out of those 4 games. But in cases where there was a team that had 2 or 3 more aggressives than their opponent, that team has never won a game. We've had that happen 3 times, and we've had that team with the 2 or 3 more aggressives lose all 3 games. And that is a stat that I just wanted to throw out there and ask Rever, what is your explanation for this? Is that just variance, or is there something to this anomaly that we're seeing right there? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So one more agri seems good, but 2 or 3 more agri is bad. That's the crux of it.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that well, firstly, most of the aggressives are similar. So you've got Inca, which is probably has a bit of a rush element to it as well. But the other three, so you've got Celts, Iroquois, Mayans, they're more build and stack and less so rush. Um, and so what you probably find is that it's almost like if you have too much of the same thing, it can actually become bad quickly. So one additional sieve that can grow and stack might be helpful, but as soon as you add a second one, to add a second or third one, you've given up getting a different civilization, and maybe your enemy has gotten that civilization that kind of counters the benefit of agri. And so one extra one is advantageous for the growth and for the stacking, but two is too much of that, and you're giving up something else. But it's interesting that it's worked out that way. I wouldn't have thought that having all agri would be that much of a disadvantage because the additional growth and those sieves that can stack would typically be, I would have thought, good. But if you find that because you've picked those agri, your opponent's getting an extra rush sieve, or one of those agri gets squashed in between 2 sieves and one of them is a rusher, you might find that it's almost too much of a good thing.
I see what you mean there. So basically, well, of course, it's not a huge sample size that we've got again, so we can't make this isn't law, but the thing is, my opinion, just on this, because it's very difficult to explain. But when you have more agri than the opponent, no matter how many more, that basically means that you're winning score from the get-go, and that at least you're getting the score edge early on. So that is no matter how many more agri than your opponent you have, that is pretty much a given just from the draft alone. Now, when the element, because you're definitely right in that, I wouldn't necessarily say you're hurting your team composition by getting more agris, but the identity of your team composition doesn't change anymore if you stack a third or a second or a third agri on top of the one that you already have, because the identity still remains. You're never gonna get outscored, but you also can't afford to die. And the more aggressives you pick, and the more you rely on just outscoring the opponent, the more vulnerable you maybe become to getting killed, especially because what you said right there, if you just get that many more aggressives than your opponent, that probably means that your opponent has been picking civs that are suited to kill you. And that is exactly what every tournament game since I've been running this has devolved into at some point. One team gets a score lead, the other team recognizes that, and knows they and has to play for a kill. And when there's that clear a discrepancy from the get-go, where it's clear which team is gonna fill which role, it becomes much easier, in my opinion, to actually get that kill that you need when you know from the get-go that you're the one who needs to force one. And that's where I want to spin it back to what I mentioned in that first or earlier on, namely the last game you guys played against Team Anti was one of these games. Team Anti had two aggressives and your team had none. Right? We've had, just to give a recap for everybody, we had Halu on Aztecs, we had SDN on Egypt, and we had Rever on Rome. Against Anti on Celts, Elk on Maya, and Kismic on India. And that is a prime example for this effect. Because if you guys remember the last podcast episode where I talked to Rabdeck, we actually thought that a composition like Team Anti had it is a very potent one. You got India providing a ton of gold, and then you got two builder civs, Maya and Celts, who can get huge upgrades out of that gold. But what in reality ended up happening is that Aztec, Egypt, and Rome are three civs that are very good at killing people, and they all they needed to do was find the advantageous matchup, which in this case was Rome versus India, and Rever just built up a couple of legions, and Kismet pretty much didn't have anything to put up against that attack. So in actuality, even though the double agri team got a small score lead early on, the pressure that the other guys were able to exert did end up overwhelming them at some point. Now, you could argue, before people start coming at me, you could argue that that matchup was heavily skewed by the map setup, because if you remember, at the very center of the map, you had Aztecs versus Celts, and that is exactly what the Aztecs want, being in the middle of the map and in range of all three enemies, whereas it's exactly what the Celts don't want, being in range of all three enemies and in the middle of the map. So maybe that was an inherent advantage for your team in that regard, but I would argue Halu didn't even get that much out of that advantage. I would argue his Aztecs didn't even do much early on. So yeah, basically to close this topic out, what do you think about how this affected that specific game that you've played last? In that zero agri versus two agri, but your team was just without much difficulty able to grab those kills and take the win there. Was that a good illustration of the point you and I just made?
Yeah, I think so. I think also that perhaps more important than Agri as a trade or any one trade of a Civ is it's the composition. It's how three Civs play together. And so I'm not saying in this particular game this was a problem, but maybe Celts and Mayans on the same teams is too much of an Agri composition. And so I'm not saying that's the case for that game or for other games, but it's about how the three civs will work together, not so much about having two or three agri, if that makes sense. And as you said before, in that game, Celts were in the middle, and civ location is so important. Perhaps if India and Celts had swapped places, so India was in the middle and Celts was in the corner, perhaps it would have been a very different game. But I think you summarized it pretty well.
All right. Yeah, that's just an interesting observation here. And I'm not sure. Maybe the last thing about this is we've mentioned before how Celts is like by far the worst performing Civ in the tourney in terms of win rate. 7 losses. So probably that also plays into this stat. If Celts really is a trap pick and is exploitable in this tournament, then if your team has a lot more aggressives than the enemy, one of those aggressives is probably the Celts, and so maybe you're hurting your team in that regard by overvaluing the Celts. But that's just, again, we're not really sure that Celts really is a bad pick. But if they are, as their win rate indicates, or at least an overrated pick, if they really are for this tournament, then that also surely is gonna affect this stat right here. And yeah, we'll see if people keep leaning into Agri that heavily, if maybe actually the priority on Agri ends up lowering and people are more comfortable going for Aztec, Sumeria, early picks or of anything of that kind. But I'm not sure. I still believe that having more Agri than your opponent is in general a good thing to aim for. But maybe just having one more Agri is enough and all that you should prioritize. All right. So that's pretty much the end of our topic list. So to close this one out, let's. I want to hit two final points. The first one is I want to open up the floor to you. If there's anything else that you've observed that you want to comment on, anything in the tournament so far that seems worthwhile pointing out to you, it's of your choosing here. You can take this any direction that you want.
Yeah. Um, maybe a couple of things.
Sure, sure.
The first one, I think, and it's probably more for people who are listening, but maybe didn't enroll in this tournament specifically, but um, it can be very hard to describe how difficult it is on these small maps where your opponent is so close. Often in, an eight-player MPT game, you have a lot more room and you probably have, 10 or 15 turns to get set up and maybe the rusher on the other team isn't right next to you. But it is quite challenging. I know I didn't play the Hunger Games tournament, so I probably, um, came in with a little bit less experience. But it is challenging having opponents so close. Your first 5, 6, 7 turns will set up the whole game. That's just something interesting for, as I said before, anyone who's been watching but maybe not playing. It's interesting, and I'd encourage all people to have a go because it's a different experience when your enemies are so close. Um, and maybe as another point, I'd probably say that what's been quite interesting is that I've always rated Rabdag as a pretty good player, and I rate him quite high. But I think he's probably been the MVP of the tournament from what I've seen so far, and so I think it's big props to him for doing so well and having such a big impact on the games that he's played. I don't know if you've seen the same.
Well, we've talked about this a bit in the anti episode early on, where I gave him the way too early tournament MVP award. So yeah, I agree that he's been very impactful. But I also have to say that after his initial success, there has been some games where maybe if he didn't get a rusher and he his or well actually I'm not even sure if it was off rushers. No, I think he's pretty much gotten rushes almost every game except that Sumeria game. But there's been some games where maybe if his rush wasn't that impactful early on, his team didn't have that great a success. And oh, of course, who could forget their loss um, against, if you remember, against Halu, where it was 3 agricultural civs versus none. You didn't play in that game, but yeah, that was the one where Halu on Persia got 2 kills. One of that being a 1v1 warrior versus warrior, I believe, against Rabdak, turn 10 or something, and Rabdak just lost that one. And pretty much, yeah, that was the game. So I think Rabdak has had some unfortunate, questionable moments maybe, but you're absolutely right that in the games where he got online, he's made a huge impact on his team, and he's probably the prime reason for why Russia civs have so quickly and clearly become the most highly prioritized type of civs in the first rotation. So I would agree. I'm not sure if I still would put him at MVP. I haven't really thought about that, but he's definitely up there. And it's been fun seeing him take MPT serious and show off what he can do there. So yeah, definitely think he's a threat. Is there anything else you wanted to comment on in terms of yeah, tournament surprises, stuff you wanted to point out?
No, I think that's it. I guess other than that, it'd be nice if you didn't put me next to the Russia Civ in every game. I
All
think the
right.
last game I managed to escape it, but the first few I've been unfortunately put right next to the Rush Civ, which has been challenging. But no, it's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
All right, that's nice then. So maybe just as a final note, of course the standings are very close right now. Your team is pretty much tied for second place with Obi right now, but you've still got 2 or 3 games left in the group stage, depending on how well you guys are doing. Do you have any predictions? Who's taking that first spot in the group, and who's winning in the semi-final then? Presuming that you get your first place prediction right. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, what's exciting is that as it stands right now, any team I think can still come first. I think I mentioned to you that I think if Team Halu wins all 3 games, I think we would come top, which is obviously a bit of a stretch, and there's games to play and they'll be difficult. But yeah, it's exciting. I mean all the teams are very strong and they're pretty close in balanced skill level, which is good. So yeah, I think it's hard to make a prediction. I mean, and some players, it seems like they'll be on vacation or they'll be away for a bit, so they might not be able to play as much as they did at the start. Yeah, it's so hard to predict because all 3 teams are pretty strong.
You don't think there's anybody like that has a definite edge on the competition right now? So I guess it's
Uh,
difficult to put.
well, yeah, I reckon that as I said before, you know, and as you mentioned, Rabdag's been playing pretty well, so I think he's probably the danger guy at the tournament at the moment. And if I had to put my money on it, he's Team Obby, isn't he?
Yep, yep.
So yeah, if I had to put my money on it, I'd say Rab and Obby are going to be a tough combination. But fingers crossed, Team Halu can win their last few matches and maybe sneak that first place.
All right, that is something to look forward to. Definitely could happen, as you said. I do believe all 3 teams are still technically in the running for first. Just to give the viewers a short recap here, or a short preview rather. In order to grab first, I believe it would be enough for Team Anti to just win that last game against you guys. I think they lock first place if they do that. For the other 2 teams, as you said, your team would have to win all 3 games that are left, and then that's locked first place as well. And Team Obi, I think they rely on you beating Team Anti, and then they OB of course beating your team in that last game of the Euro series. So I think that would put them in first place. Although again, I'm not 100% confident in that, but I think that's what it was. So as you're saying, it could be anybody's game at this point. If I had to guess, personally, I would still expect Team Anti to come in first in this group stage. That is what I think. I think they are gonna win in the game against you guys actually because they'll have first pick for that last match. I think that's gonna be pretty big. And after that, that would mean that the semifinals are your team versus Team Obi, and that one is super difficult to predict. As you said, probably affected big time by player availability, and that's a tough call. I think if the players are there, I'd have a really hard time giving it to your team, but I somehow feel like it feels terrible predicting against Obi and Red Deck because, as you said, they're such a powerful 1-2 punch, and archery is probably not going to be available here for the semifinals. But I still somehow feel like your top 4, Halu, Rever, Towel, and SDN. I feel like that is scary enough for me to say that your team might actually be taking that serious if it came to a semifinal between you and Obi. But that's just my predictions for now, and Of course, a lot can change still in that regard. So that's it for me. Any closing remarks you got? Anything left to say?
No, just thanks for having me on. It's been good to chat.
Sure, you're welcome anytime, and I'll be hosting less more tournament podcast episodes to come, definitely. So tune in for those as well. For everybody watching, thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed that little chat, and I'll catch you guys in the next tourney games at some point throughout the next week.